Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is the third reflection upon the book Usul al Fiqh al Islamic by Dr. Taha Jabir, or Source Methodology in Islamic Jurisprudence as is translated into English. One of the concepts which I felt was important to bring to the table to emphasize the concept and distinguish it was the notion of Usul al Fiqh being the queen of sciences. This was mentioned in the last reflection and is taken up again in this reflection. And I wanted to elaborate on the idea that Usul al Fiqh draws from other sciences, but in the same line of reasoning, or at the same time stands on its own. So it borrows, but it has its own identity. Usul al Fiqh is a science which is actually an amalgamation, a marriage of different sciences brought together under one umbrella. Usul al Fiqh draws from the Arabic language an understanding of those patterns which are constant, right? An understanding of those patterns which are constant in the Quran and the Sunnah, those linguistic patterns which we find with regularity. Usul al Fiqh ensures that there's some principles that it outlines within its works to help us to deal with the Arabic language. How to work with a statement which is general, how to make something specific, how to qualify something, so on and so forth. And it also deals with logic. Logic actually is important in Usul al-Fiqh and Islamic sciences in general, in the later stage of Islamic sciences, among the later day scholars. Because actually the Muslims, when they dealt with Greek logic, although in some cases we may have some debates regarding the practice of logic or the use of logic or the study of logic, that's not our line of investigation here. But what I want to say is that logic is important because logic helps us to understand the Arabic language and to come to understand how to define something. Logic is used as a means to understand not only the Arabic language but also how to construct definitions in Usul al-Fiqh. This is later day of Usul, of course. Earlier day Usul has a different approach to the matter. They use the logic of the Arabic language and don't have to necessarily draw from the logic that we find in the curriculum as it's taught in different schools around the Muslim world, which is based on Aristotelian logic. So Usul al-Fiqh draws from the Arabic language and draws from logic. It uses the Arabic language to understand and to pinpoint principles that govern the patterns and repeating patterns in the Arabic language, and it uses logic primarily to deal with definitions. And you see that Arabic and logic impacts Quranic sciences and the sciences of the Sunnah. So these two sciences, Arabic and logic, we find not only that they influence Usul al-Fiqh, but they influence the other sciences as well. Now, the Quran, or those sciences which pertain to the Quran, we find that Usul al-Fiqh, there's a portion of this body of knowledge which is dealt with and which overlaps between Quranic sciences and Usul al-Fiqh. Although Quranic sciences stand on their own as a body of knowledge, there's an overlapping point between Usul al-Fiqh and the sciences of the Quran, and the same is to be said about the Sunnah. We know that the scholars of Hadith stand on their own, the scholars of Tafsir stand on their own, and Ulum al-Quran, or the sciences of the Quran, but we know that there's a part in which they share those sciences with Usul al Fiqh. Knowledge of the Sunnah that is shared with Usul al Fiqh pertains to what? Pertains to the categorization of Hadith. How do we deal with certain aspects of Hadith? The scholars of Usul have their own positions on how you deal with a Hadith. Sometimes they overlap with the scholars of Fiqh. Sometimes they overlap with the scholars of Hadith, and sometimes they don't. The ulama in Usul al-Fiqh, they also have an overlap with the scholars of Tafsir or the Ulum al-Quran, especially when we talk about the history of the Quran, when we talk about the concept of mutawatir, and this overlaps with the concept of Hadith also, that is presented in the sciences of Hadith, which investigates the narration which is called mutawatir. And actually, we know that the idea of mutawatir actually came from Usul al-Fiqh. Mutawatir is a transmission of the Sunnah or transmission of the Quran. But in this case, let's stick to the definition of the Sunnah. Transmission of the Sunnah, which is related by a group that's trustworthy, that's so large that it's impossible to say that they have fabricated a matter or they have united in some sort of conspiracy to come about, to bring about a particular point or to make a particular case. This hadith of mutawatir, this idea of mutawatir, which we find in hadith sciences, that actually founded in Usul al-Fiqh, and then it carried itself over into the Sunnah sciences. Just to show you how there's interchange between the different sciences. We don't want to go too deep, but we just want to let you know that each science stands on its own, but at the same time it influences another science. Same thing with ilm al-kalam or aqidah studies. We could easily say that, Arabic influences the study of aqidah, whether there's metaphor in the Arabic language or not. That's a topic which is discussed in the Arabic language, but it has prominence in aqidah, it has prominence in tafsir, it has prominence in usul al-fiqh, and it also will have prominence in fiqh. Something as simple as whether there's metaphor in the Arabic language, which is actually a discussion that we find in the Arabic language studies as its separate discipline, and we see that it impacts so many things, and it will impact also how we understand the Sunnah. Usul al-Fiqh draws from fiqh examples to prove itself, to prove its principles. But here there is actually a flow in terms of relationship. Why? Because Usul al-Fiqh produces fiqh when there's ijtihad that takes place. Ijtihad means that there's independent research. So fiqh will be produced. So fiqh supplies general examples to prove the principles of Usul al-Fiqh, but also the fiqh also gives birth to fiqh when it's applied, when it's engaged in. To try to make this more simple, Usul al-Fiqh was not codified. Fiqh came first. The principles of Usul al-Fiqh were understood historically without having necessarily to speak of them. People were accustomed to practicing fiqh, to producing fiqh. They understood the principles governing fiqh and what was necessary to produce good fiqh. But it was in the time of Imam Shafi'i that Usul al-Fiqh became codified and written. It was understood in the minds of the people. It was there in their practice, but it was not codified till later. So we see this relationship between fiqh and Usul al-Fiqh is one that's very dynamic. And overall, without going too much further, what we want to establish is that Usul al-Fiqh as a science, as a queen science, draws from all the other sciences. So if one wants to get good at Usul al-Fiqh, One will master the sciences of the Sunnah, Arabic language and logic, Quranic sciences, some aspects of Aqidah and Fiqh. If one wants to be good in all these sciences, one studies Usul al Fiqh with depth, then branches off into the sciences of the Sunnah, sciences of Arabic and logic, sciences of the Quran, sciences of Aqidah, sciences of Fiqh. Either way, Usul al Fiqh brings within itself what is necessary to produce fiqh and to produce a sound understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah, to be able to draw Aqidah from it, and to be able to interpret the Quran and the Sunnah, and to be able to interpret the relationship of the Quran to the Sunnah and the Sunnah to the Quran, vice versa, and so on and so forth. Usul al-Fiqh bridges all these different sciences together and gives us a system by which we can perform research. I just wanted to indicate to you how Usul al-Fiqh draws from other sciences and is influenced by it.